Thank you very much, Gary. I appreciate it. And thank you all for the time this evening. It's a privilege to be out here. NCBA, with our direct members, we have about 26,000 folks, but with our state affiliates, we have 176,000. You guys are the meat of our membership, and you're the meat of our policy process. Every resolution that we pass at convention or summer business meetings starts at one of your county cattlemen associations. So it's always a privilege to be out here and get to talk with y'all. As Gary mentioned, it was a bit of an active week, an active day, despite the government shutdown. And I have a bad habit of talking really fast. So if I start to go too fast or there's something, just flag me down, yell at me, doesn't matter. But we're going to kind of start with what's going on right now, because there is no shortage of things happening. We'll zoom out a little bit, look at what's happened so far this year. There's a lot of news to report out of the One Big Beautiful Bill that passed this summer, and then we'll kind of look at what we can expect from the rest of the year out of our lawmakers and regulators in Washington, assuming, of course, that they decide to go back to work and do their jobs. Not a lot of people have the option to just say, I'm not going to work this month or I'm not going to work this year, but that seems to be a bad habit that we have in DC right now. So we're obviously on day 17 of a federal government shutdown. First 2 weeks, you don't see too many things trickling out, frankly, outside of some extraneous staff, or I say extraneous, they all do a job, but non-essential staff in Washington and in all the headquarters offices for the Environmental Protection Agency, for USDA, whatnot. We are now well past that 2-week mark, and this is when, there's no kids in here, right? This is when the shit starts to hit the fan in a big way, because we have FSA offices, obviously, that are understaffed to begin with, and are now only operating in some cases with one person in there for 1 day a week. You've got services like loans that are interrupted. You've got EQIP payments that are interrupted and whatnot. So that's a very long way of saying that we realize that we are now well deep into the portion where this really starts to impact folks out in the country. And that is a message that we are taking to your lawmakers as often as possible. It is tricky when they decide to leave town and not want to see anybody, but we are pretty good at this point at chasing them down wherever they may be and delivering that message that it's time to get the government back open. Whether you are a progressive Democrat or a small c conservative Republican, there is no upside to having the federal government this dysfunctional and shut down. So that is the message that we are taking to folks in DC. We want to get some of those essential programs back up and running. I've gotten the question a couple times, how long is this going to go? I would say smart money, put it November 1st. Pessimistic money, maybe put it December 15th, 16th, 17th. I would expect by the 3rd week of December, we're going to be back in a position where people are approaching the end of the year, approaching the holidays, starting to get really hostile reactions when they're back home in their districts, and they're going to have to get their butts back to DC and figure something out. The reason I think this is going to go at least for a little bit longer through November 1st is because that is when open enrollment begins for the Affordable Care Act healthcare marketplaces, and that is really at the center of this shutdown. We're in a situation where the House passed a CR, a continuing resolution, to just maintain funding levels, right? They passed that on September 19th, I believe. And if the Senate had passed that, we'd be open right now. We'd be operating under those same funding levels, just cruising through. I believe that CR extended into late November. So it's kicking the can down the road, but it's the least bad of all of the cans that Congress tends to pick from at this point in the year. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The House passed it, and then the Senate stalled out around this disagreement about extending tax credits that subsidize the premium payments for about 20 million Americans who are on healthcare plans through the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Those are due to expire at the end of December anyway, so this is an issue that was going to come up at some point in 2025. Senate Democrats decided to bring it up now and make it their main bargaining chip when it came to shutting down the government. I genuinely do not know right now what is going to happen with those tax credits, but I can tell you that we are in a little bit of an unusual situation with this shutdown, which is nobody has a good reason to move. I started working on Capitol Hill during the last longest shutdown in 2019, which was a very odd time to be there. But there were a lot of factors to that got things moving again and brought folks back to the table. This one is a little bit different. On the Democratic side, you have a base that is extremely pissed about how the Trump administration has been running things for the, so far in 2025. And in their view, their lawmakers have kind of rolled over and let a lot of stuff happen. And this is really their last opportunity to take a big stand on a banner issue for them, healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, and sort of hold the line. They have failed to do so in the view of their voters so many times now that this is really the last time they can make that statement in 2025 before a whole lot of them, including the Senate Minority Leader, are looking at some pretty uncomfortable primary challenges. So they don't have a lot of incentive to do anything right now. On the Republican side of the aisle, a little bit different. They've got some incentive to get things done right. They've got majorities in both chambers. They've got the seat in the White House. They have a lot of items they want to get done. But, and I don't think this is breaking news to anybody in this room because you see it constantly. You've seen it throughout this term. You saw it during his first term. This party, particularly right now, does not budge unless President Trump tells them to. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. It is simply a reality. And right now, President Trump has been extremely preoccupied with foreign policy issues. He's been very busy overseas, as you all have seen in the news. And frankly, there's a lot of items right now about the current shutdown environment that work pretty well for him and for his goals at OMB, Office of Budget and Management, and Mr. Russ Vought, who is the director over there, who has been kind of the spearhead or the force behind a lot of the reductions in federal spending, the DOGE cuts earlier this year and whatnot. Those are kind of his brainchild. So at the end of the day, you've got Republicans up on the Hill saying, well, we could try and figure this out, but we're not getting a strong indication from the president that we need to do so yet. And you've got Democrats saying this is our last hill to die on and we're going to do it. And so I do not think this is a typical shutdown in the sense that there is really no incentive at this point on day 17 for folks to come together. Once we get to day 30, that might look a little different. But I would say for folks who are saying, when is this going to be over? Expect that it's going to be another 2 to 3 weeks, potentially longer. There's a couple other things that are a little unusual about this shutdown compared to past ones. Obviously, we always deal with some furloughed workers. We always deal with an interruption in services. But that OMB factor, that Russ Vought factor that I mentioned and that you hear a lot about in the news is really the defining thing that makes this different. The Trump administration is taking the opportunity during the shutdown to cut the budgets of some programs that they don't believe should be funded and they think are unnecessary. You saw this earlier in the year with the DOGE cuts and some of the reductions in federal workforce, and you're seeing it again now. Again, I'm not making a value judgment on whether that's good or bad, but that is what they are aggressively pursuing at this time. That's another thing that makes it really difficult for Republicans to cut a deal and get the Democratic votes that they need to reopen the government at this point. One of the other issues, in addition to the Affordable Care Act, that Democrats are choosing to sort of put their line in the sand on is what they call pocket rescissions, or basically the president deciding, I'm not going to spend, the executive branch is not going to spend some of the funds that have been previously appropriated by Congress for X project or X department or X agency. It's something that legal scholars disagree on who has the authority to do that, but the Trump administration is looking at the facts in front of them and saying, I think I can do this. So we're going to just shelve some of that money and decide not to spend it on some of the priorities that have been previously authorized and appropriated by Congress, in some cases in previous Congresses, in some cases just last year under the Biden administration. So those vary in terms of the things that they're going after and looking to scale down, but that's kind of where we stand with the shutdown. I've also got some notes down here, which I hate looking at notes, but I'm going to have to at some point because we've got a lot to cover tonight, so I apologize about that. But shutdown-wise, that's kind of where we stand. What else is going on in D.C.? And Gary kind of alluded to it, and a few of you have asked questions about it. The comments yesterday following the meeting with President Milei from I always say that wrong, from Argentina. This is a very typical fire drill that we have experienced, I would say, every day, and in some cases 4 times a day since President Trump took office. He likes to say something out in public, often in a press conference or at an event like that, and then it sends everybody else scrambling. This is the case with whoever is president. For the record, every time the president of the United States makes a bold, definitive statement, there are a lot of other dominoes around the world that fall. But it is particularly the case with this president who likes to make very bold, definitive, policy statements out in public, sometimes before the Secretary of Agriculture even knows about it. And that is the case with what happened here. The minute that happened yesterday, myself, Ethan, Colin, all our colleagues at NCBA were on the phone with our folks at the White House, at USDA, and with the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative's office, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. And the good news, our glass half full perspective, is nothing is on paper yet, nothing is written in stone. The glass half empty answer is there's some not so great ideas out right now that we need to prevent from getting written into stone. The USTR's best idea for how to implement President Trump's stated goal, which if you missed that meeting or you didn't see it in the news, it was we're going to bring down beef prices, we're going to lower beef prices, and we've got some exciting new ideas to do that. The timing there after this meeting with the president of Argentina was not coincidental. So that's why this caused a lot of attention and a lot of panic in some cases. The idea that is being floated at USTR now is to carve out either a temporary quota for Argentinian imports, beef imports, or to include Argentina under an existing TRQ or a quota essentially that is kind of an other bucket, a miscellaneous bucket for countries that don't have a permanent full trade deal with the United States. That's what's being discussed right now. I don't think anybody in this room would say, yes, by all means, let's import more beef from another country to address the prices that consumers are seeing at the grocery store. That is not a solution that helps our producers. It's not a solution ultimately that is sustainable and is going to work for consumers either. And so that is something we are vociferously fighting from seeing put into action. There is no timeline attached to that right now. And I'm not just saying that to be vague or anything. There is truly no timeline. What's happened here is that President Trump has set a goal that is pretty broad and a pretty broad statement. We want to lower beef prices. And now all the different departments, USDA, USTR, State Department in some cases, they all have to look at that and figure out how do we match a plan to the goal. Sometimes that's easier said than done. And in many cases, obviously, we would love for the plan to come first and then maybe that informs the goal, but that's just not the way that this one rolled out. So there is nothing yet decided. There's certainly nothing agreed to with Argentina yet, but we have some very important work to do over the next couple days. And we've already started that process last night to kill any idea of increasing Argentina's import access to the United States for beef. Under the guise of sort of lowering beef prices. One thing that I do want to say, I can't see Valerie if she's still here, but beef prices are high for consumers at the grocery store, and beef demand is still really high. People are buying it. This is still the best protein product in the world, and that is down to the quality of the work that you all do every day. So I do want to just get a plug in real quick for the checkoff. NCBA happens to be the largest checkoff contractor this year. In 10 years, we may very well not be, and I'm not going to be upset about that. I'm still going to defend the checkoff just as strongly as I do today, because at the end of the day, they give you a tremendous investment, return on your investment. And when those prices start to go up and consumers spend that extra half second or that extra 2 seconds thinking about, I don't know, do I want to spend the money and buy this product? The work that the checkoff has done, particularly since COVID, to tell people this is what you buy, this is how you handle each of these cuts, this is how you cook it at home, etc., has really paid off because people are still buying it. But that's kind of what's going on with Argentina. Like I said, we had some of these conversations with the staff at USTR at about 1 Eastern time last night, and so they were not the most lucid responses that we got from them in the world, but we are going to keep after them until we have a commitment that we are not messing with or upping any of the access that our trade partners have to import beef into the United States. Now, that said, once President Trump has something out there, especially when he stated it in public like this, he's not going to let it go, right? He's not going to forget. So we do need to put some more thought behind this goal or drive that the administration has to lower beef prices for consumers. That's a tricky needle to thread in some cases because it's pretty basic supply and demand, right? What do we not have a whole lot of right now in the United States? Cattle, right? We are low. We are really, really low. And that's doing some pretty decent things for cattle prices, but it's also doing some things for beef prices that have gotten the attention of an administration that is laser focused on those kitchen table consumer issues. Look at how much attention they spent on highly pathogenic avian influenza and egg prices at the beginning of this term. That was Secretary Rollins' #1 thing was we've got to get egg prices down. I think the way that they went about doing that is not necessarily great for the American farmer or rancher because the main way they've brought egg prices down is by importing them from Turkey. That is not something that we want to see happen in the beef sector. We are meeting demand with our own supply. There is no need to increase the access for Argentina or frankly any other country in South America, especially when they have the really bad habit of failing to report things like BSE 4 months after they're required to do so. So as long as that's still happening, they do not deserve increased access. And there are some countries like Brazil that don't deserve any access at all, but that's getting off onto another tangent. So that's where we stand with Argentina. And I would say just stay tuned to your inboxes, because as soon as we have that kind of commitment and we get to where we want to be on that issue, you'll see that in our newsletters and our other NCBA communications, and we'll share that out with our affiliates like Tennessee Cattlemen's. But that's where we stand on that particular issue. What else is going on in DC right now? There's not a whole lot besides the shutdown, and there's not a whole lot besides some of the comments that we're seeing out in the trade space. But overall, I think it's good to just zoom out for a second and recognize that even if we weren't shut down right now, this would still be an extremely goofy environment on Capitol Hill. And that's a pretty complimentary way to put it. They are in extremely tight margins, as they have been for the last few Congresses. At last count, and I have to check this one because there's some members who've been elected and still not sworn in yet, so we still have 2 vacancies in the House, but we've got 219 Republican members, we've got 214 Democrats. That is an extremely thin and competitive margin no matter what you're voting on. The Senate's not much better. You've got 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, 2 independents that caucus with the Democrats. This isn't new. Pretty much for my entire lifetime, we've had really, really close margins in both chambers. And also in my entire lifetime, we have failed to pass regular appropriations. And that kind of brings me to my next thing here that we're dealing with in Washington for the next couple weeks. Ideally, we'd have 12 separate appropriations bills for how to fund each section of the federal government, right? We've got one for Ag FDA that does USDA and the FDA and other sections of HHS. You've got Labor H, you've got the Transpo bill, you've got all these different ones that go department by department and say this is what the budget is going to be. Normally, those are supposed to pass as 12 separate bills. There are some folks in the room who were alive the last time that happened. I was not. And so what we've started to do instead, because again, Congress is lazy, is package them all up into one omnibus at the end of the year. That's the only thing that they can get done. They're pretty dysfunctional, they're pretty gridlocked, and they really only want to do their job twice a year. It's usually for the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and for some kind of omnibus. And so we basically get 2 swings at the piñata every year to pass actual legislation through Congress. We're pretty good at it by now, but it is tricky. And so there are a couple priorities that we push for every single year in the appropriations process that right now, this stretch between late October and December 31st, this is our crunch time. This is our go time to make sure that all of those priorities make it into the final omnibus bill. There are plenty of organizations. HSUS is kind of the best at it, but there are plenty who try PETA, ASPCA, OCM, on and on. There are all kinds of groups that sort of recognize the chaotic environment at the end of the year, and they say, this is my chance to go in and cut some of those out. So this is a real whack-a-mole time of year for us to make sure that those all make it in. Biggest ones that we're always pushing for are a ban on any requirement for greenhouse gas emissions reporting on farm. We've gotten that in for close to 10 years now, and we're going to keep pursuing that. There's some other ones that prevent listings under the Endangered Species Act for some specific species. And then the big one that I'm spending time on right now is increasing the money at USDA that is available to send cost-free tags to states for complying with the traceability rule that was finalized last year. That requirement for electronic ID tags for interstate movement for a certain section of the cattle herd, we're trying to up the number of free tags basically that go out from 8 million to 11 million. So those are some of our priorities that we're tracking in that omnibus towards the end of the year. We're pretty confident that we will get all of our policy riders that we usually shoot for included in that, but it's a little bit of a dicey process because again, Congress really only gives us 2 swings at getting this done, and then the rest of the year they talk a very big game and don't do a whole lot of legislating. That said, there's one big exception to that, and that was the One Big Beautiful Bill this year. So this past summer, you might have seen, it was called One Big Beautiful Bill, Reconciliation Bill. These are all the same thing. Now they're sort of rebranding it as the Working Families Tax Cuts Act, so you might hear that in the news. They're all talking about the same giant piece of legislation, the Reconciliation Bill that passed through the House and the Senate with a lot of President Trump's sort of immediate and most urgent and top priorities that he wanted to see dealt with in Congress when he first came in for his second term. So that was a real, sort of lightning in a bottle moment for us, because again, we don't get too many chances to get Congress to actually move on something. And this was one exception where they really moved quickly and got something pretty significant passed through both chambers and signed into law under President Trump's direction and leadership. So we've got a couple really big wins in there that I wanted to highlight real quick. The first one is on the animal health front. There are 3 things that we try to get out of a farm bill every time we have a farm bill. Funding for the Nolan laboratory network across the country, the veterinary labs, funding for the NADPREP program. Some of you might be familiar with that or have participated, animal disease preparedness grants that come out of that, and then funding for the foot and mouth disease vaccine bank. As you all have undoubtedly noticed, Congress messed up yet again, and we don't have a farm bill. We were supposed to have one in 2023, and it didn't happen. And then we were supposed to have one in 2024, didn't happen again. This was one area where we were able to get a lot of the priorities that we normally push for in a farm bill context into this reconciliation bill. So funding for those animal health programs, we got fully funded at every level. $153 million for the vaccine bank, 70 for the Nolan Lab Network, and 10 million for NADPREP. So that's a huge win for us. Takes a lot of pressure off of that farm bill conversation, at least for the cattle sector. The other big area that we got in reconciliation was tax wins, and this is a really huge one. My colleague Kent has been pushing on these for literally 15 years, and he finally had his day with the reconciliation bill. So death tax exemption was permanently increased to $15 million for individuals and $30 million for couples, adjusted annually for inflation. We also got Section 199A, the deductions for owners of things like S corps or partnerships, made permanent at 20%. And bonus depreciation made permanent at 100%. So those are some really big priorities in the tax space that we have been pushing on for literally 10, 15, 20 years. And we finally got the opportunity to get those done and signed into law with the reconciliation bill. That is a massive win for us in the cattle sector. There are a lot of other ag items that passed under that bill. A lot of them are more relevant in the crop space, but I'll shout out a couple. We've got 100% indemnity payments on losses due to federally protected species, 75% for weather. Obviously that, win tends to mean a little bit more when the government's actually open and paying outright, which they're not right now, but hopefully when we get back into a normal environment, that'll be a good thing to see. Payments for loss of unborn livestock under LIP, livestock indemnity program. $18.5 billion for EQIP, $8 billion for CSP, and then just under $3 billion for RCCP. Those are some of the conservation program and sort of loss protection programs that we always, again, go after in a farm bill context, but we kind of had to find another way to skin that cat and go after it for reconciliation. All of this is to say, there's a lot of talk right now in DC about maybe pursuing a skinny farm bill. What are the things that we didn't get done in 2023, in 2024, and so far in 2025 that we need to see? And I'm fully aware that there are a huge number of priorities that for crop folks did not get addressed in reconciliation. There is no doubt about it that for livestock and crops, livestock came out way better from reconciliation. So there's still a lot of things left undone on the crop side that there are a lot of folks in Congress who want to address through a skinny farm bill or a mini farm bill at some point in 2026. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but I do think we're going to have to get creative and find another way to skin that cat again, because we've noticed a really interesting deterioration over the last couple of years in the farm bill process. Farm bill used to be the thing that everybody supported, right? Republicans, Democrats, didn't matter. It's a heavily bipartisan project. By and large, historically, you have a lot of Democratic members on the House Ag Committee and Senate Ag who push really hard for some of those nutrition programs, right? And then you've got a lot of folks from rural districts who push for the sort of production and commodity ag side and all of those programs. The bill over the years has become really heavily slated towards those nutrition programs. About 80% of the last Farm Bill 2018 went towards nutrition programs, about 20% went towards production agriculture. So far, that sort of uneasy balance and that alliance has held pretty well right up until it didn't. One thing that Democrats pursued really aggressively was making changes to SNAP, and then Republicans sort of countered that with updates to SNAP work requirements, for example, and a couple other things that impacted those nutrition programs. That all played out during that reconciliation bill fight earlier this year. And once that thing passed and went into law, that sort of uneasy alliance or that agreement to sort of be bipartisan and pursue something that's good for agriculture and good for our national food supply blew up. And there is now really very little bipartisan agreement on pursuing a farm bill. You're going to hear a lot of talk from Chairman G.T. Thompson, who's a member from Pennsylvania, who's the current Republican chairman of the House Agriculture Committee. I think he is the most optimistic man alive. I have never seen him sort of say die or adjust his outlook at all. So you're going to hear a lot in public from him saying, we're getting a skinny farm bill done this year. I wouldn't put any money on it. I think this is a situation where there's really a lack of will on the left side of the aisle to come back and discuss any of the provisions that production agriculture needs because they feel like they got stung on nutrition programs. And so in 2026, when Congress is hopefully out of a shutdown, back at their desks, ostensibly doing their jobs as much as they ever are, we're going to have to find another package or another vehicle to carry some of those remaining crop items over the finish line. There's not going to be another reconciliation bill, so I don't know what that's going to be. But really what, we used to be a pretty decent legislating process in Congress is now more of like a game of trying to get the last bus leaving the station. It's like, what's still here? What can we jump onto the back of, get the things that we need on before it pulls out of the station? And I think that's what you're going to see unfold in 2026 for some of those remaining crop provisions. The other thing that I want to mention in the category of kind of what's DC up to, and then we'll talk more about some specific issues, but what are they up to? What can we expect? Where does the clown show go from here? The only real big item that we have left on our docket for the rest of the year, in addition to getting the government reopened and getting those priorities included in an appropriations package in an omnibus, is farm aid. It's no secret there's pretty severe impacts trickling down from some of the tariff-wars right now to our crop producers, particularly in the soybean space. Livestock, like I said, there's a lot of cases, like with the reconciliation process, where we're not necessarily pulling for the same things as crop. This is the exception where the rubber hits the road, and it's like either a rising tide is going to lift us all right, or it's going to flood and it's going to sink everybody. It doesn't do us any favors in the livestock space if we have row crop folks going under. And so we have a very vested interest in seeing some kind of farm aid come out of the administration and go towards payments for farmers who are suffering due to the tariff impacts. There's some hitches to that, because there always are, right? None of this is ever simple, and there's no such thing as free money. The current proposal is to do somewhere between $50 billion and $70 billion put out by President Trump's decision from the executive branch, so they don't have to go to Congress and try to get something passed while the government is shut down, but to pull somewhere between $50 and $70 billion out of a bucket at USDA, they haven't decided which yet, and send that out as payments for row crop folks. The place where that gets tricky, and the place where we are trying to figure out where to pull that money from and which line item that should be, is that the number one contender right now for where to get the money is something called the CCC, or the Commodity Credit Corporation over at USDA. The CCC has become in recent years like everybody's favorite piggy bank. Every time there's something that needs to happen in ag, as a consequence, I would say, of Congress's dysfunction and the fact that it is so hard for us to just appropriate money like we're supposed to, we have really become over-reliant on tapping the CCC for funds when we get into emergency situations. You've seen a lot of disaster aid, for example, in recent years come from the CCC before disaster supplemental packages were passed in Congress. And one of the problems we're dealing with is that we have some items, most notably screwworm, that are about to cost us a lot of money. And where did we think that was going to come from? Where were we kind of hoping to shake the piggy bank? At the CCC. So again, it doesn't mean we're opposed to anything, and it doesn't mean we're not going to, try like hell to find another place to get those crop payments from. But we've got to find another place, in our opinion, on the livestock side, because if we drain the CCC, we are going to have nothing for a fairly serious and imminent animal health situation that we are looking at dealing with here in the not too distant future. That's kind of what we've got going on. I'm going to move on to some very specific issues, just give a rundown on those, and then I will stop yapping at you and get some questions. But I'm going to start with screwworm, because that is the thing that has sort of been dominating my life for the last 13 months and is tattooed somewhere on the inside of my eyelids every night. I see screwworm, screwworm, screwworm. But this part is going to sound a little Chicken Little-y, and that is on purpose. I think throughout the last 13 months, when I've gotten questions on screwworm, it's been very tricky to sort of sift through all the different streams of information that people are getting. There are posts on Facebook, some of which are derived from reality, some of which are not. There are updates from USDA, which are sometimes out of date by the time you see it, and they've already put out something different. And there are updates from Mexico, which are the least reliable in this entire situation and have sent us on not a few optimistic, kicks that later we sort of got kicked in the butt for because they turned out to not be true. That is kind of what we're dealing with. Misinformation is our number one problem right now in the screwworm space, and frankly, we need all of your help in dealing with that, because we've got to get a handle on some of the rumors that are market moving and they show up online and then they end up to not be true. But where are we at on screwworm? The closest cases in Mexico are now in Nuevo León, which is one of the states in Mexico that borders our southern border, so it is very close. Again, this is where we get into this fuzziness on what's accurate and what's not, but Mexico will tell you that the nearest case in Nuevo León has been pushed back and is now about 170 miles from Laredo, from the border. It is probably more accurate that it's about somewhere between 50 and 70 miles from the border. That is our best projection and guess based on wildlife movements, based on cattle movements, and based on weather down there at the moment. So regardless, either way, it's in spitting distance, right? It's close. The biggest thing that's sort of working against us right now in screwworm is time and weather. Screwworms can pupate underground. They start as a fly, they go into the wound, maggots, larvae, burrow. You get those gory photos, right, of New World screwworm myiasis in animals. They drop from the wound, they go to the ground, go underground, pupate, emerge as a fly. That pupa part underground can happen as long as the ground temperature is above 43 degrees. There is most of the southern United States right now where that is still the case, and it's going to be for several weeks, if not several more months. New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, a lot of parts of the Gulf, it's warm. And so we are not out of the woods yet on this. A lot of states to the north of where we're sitting tonight have sort of started to back off and say, I'm a little bit less worried about this. This is a next year problem. It's not a 2025 problem. In my pessimistic, chicken little, the sky is falling opinion, I do not think any of us can afford to treat this as a next year problem, because it is probably going to be a Texas problem at the very least in the next month with the pace at which it's moving. And once it gets here, it is really difficult to get rid of. So to that end, what are we doing to deal with this? Well, number one, we've been funding all kinds of efforts in Mexico for the last year and honestly the last 30 years to try and push this thing back. I'm not going to waste your time with those because clearly they didn't work, right? It's still here anyway. In the United States, NCBA for the last 13 months has been pushing for the construction of a sterile fly production facility in the United States. This is to create those sterile male screwworm flies that we drop in the environment. They outcompete the wild ones and they drop down the population. That's how we've controlled this over the last couple decades. It's how we eradicated it from the US the last time we had it in the 1960s, and it's how we're going to eradicate it this time. But we don't have a production facility. And the one in Panama that we've historically relied on is no longer up to the challenge for the number of flies that we need to cover the large geographic area that we're now talking about. So priority number one for us was and continues to be that sterile fly production facility, say that 5 times fast, in southern Texas. Why Texas? We picked something in the middle. We wanted it to be as easy for them to fly and distribute flies over Southern California or Arizona as it was over Mississippi or Georgia or Florida. And so right in South Texas was the right place to put that. They have picked a site. USDA has committed the money to it. They have yet to break ground on the facility. And that is something that, frankly, as the minute the government gets back open, that is something we are going to hit extremely hard. We've got to get rolling on that yesterday. And so trying to make sure that there's absolutely no red tape there. I will be completely frank with y'all. I don't know what the holdup is at this point. I don't know why they haven't started yet. We've been told repeatedly by high up USDA folks, yeah, it's important. Well, if it's important, you've got to build it. So let's get going on that. If there's a permit issue, we're going to tackle that. If there's some sort of water issue, which there shouldn't be at this stage because they've already picked a site, we'll deal with that. But at the end of the day, we got to get that thing built ASAP. So sterile flies are really important. There's another thing we can do to increase our number of sterile insects, and that's things like improving the gene pool, using gene modification to make all male flies, for example. We can only use the male ones. So right now from the facility in Panama, we get 50% of them are just wasted because they're female. So there's some things like gene editing that we can do to increase that population of usable flies. There's different techniques for sterilization. Right now they irradiate all of them. There's some other ones. But the one that I am most excited about and that we have spent the most time on at NCBA pushing forward with USDA, in which we have now got USDA's agreement to fund a pilot project for, is M3, this company that does modular units. So they're basically a sterile fly facility shrunk down into a trailer that they can move around and do for much cheaper and drop in these specific areas that need an emergency infusion of flies. Now, they can only do about 8,000 or 9,000 a week. And to cover the area of the United States that we would like to cover at this point, we're going to need 400 million a week. So this is not a good long-term solution, but while we're waiting for that facility to be built, we figure some is better than nothing. Let's get those trailers out there ASAP and put them in some of those hot spots like southern Florida, southern Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, to start churning out whatever number of flies we can, because again, something's better than nothing. Other thing we need to do on the screwworm front that we're pursuing right now is treatments. And this is something you might have seen in the news the other week. FDA put out their first approval for a animal drug in the US that is labeled for screwworm. It was Dectomax, which, as most of you know, is a dormectin product. There are a lot of different treatment options out there, and this is one of those things where I say it's really important to check your information. And the best example that I have for that is a couple weeks ago, my phone was blowing up. I had a huge number of folks all across the Southwest who said, I'd see this ad for feed-through ivermectin for screwworm. Is this what I should be stocking up on? Is this the thing that's going to work? Well, there was a really aggressive ad campaign put out there pushing that on Facebook. The unfortunate part is we've only ever studied feed-through ivermectin against screwworm in monogastrics like pigs. We have no evidence that it works in ruminants like cattle. So there's some of these products where I think we might be getting slightly ahead of our skis, but there are things that we know work. So injectable ivermectin, porons, 3% Coumaphos, that is a huge one that we are trying to get re-registered in the US. We used to have access to it. Now they only use it for the cattle fever tick dip vats in Texas, and permethrin products, permethrins. So there is a variety of items that do work. None of them are labeled, except for Dectomax, for screwworm use in the United States right now. I think there's actually one exception to that right now, actually. So I take that back. EPA just approved one in the permethrin space for screwworm. So we only have 2 that are labeled for screwworm. As y'all know, you can still use ivermectin or dormectin off-label, but it comes with some strings attached, right? And you cannot use a pesticide that is registered under the EPA off-label at all. So even though there are products out there that we know are useful and effective against screwworm and that folks used in the 1960s and they can still use today, we want to make sure that the way is greased, the skids are greased, and there is absolutely nothing standing in the way of a producer being able to get that product, use it in cattle for screwworm purposes, and just be in 100% compliance and not have to worry about a single thing on whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing vis-a-vis the regulation around those products. We want this to be as simple and as abundant as possible. And the abundance piece of that takes me to the weirdest conversations I've had over the last couple of months, which is sitting around a big table in DC with all the folks who lobby for the animal drug companies and saying, do you guys have the supply to meet this demand? Because we are going to need these products in the not so distant future. What does that look like? Drug companies are drug companies. They have a job to do. They have a business to run. They have to see a significant financial incentive in it for them to start pumping out more of that product and avoid a situation where we have any sort of disruptions in the supply chain or delays for folks who are out there trying to buy ivermectin, for example. But that is something that we remain pushing on, shall we say, in increasingly less polite terms with those companies, because they play a really big role in getting those approvals through the FDA and the EPA. If the company isn't pushing for it, it's really hard to get the regulators to move on that. So that is the very big universe of things that we're doing on screwworm. I can get into more detail on any of those later, but I don't want to put everybody to sleep. The number one biggest piece of screwworm news that you are going to see probably from from the Tennessee Cattlemen's Association or from your state animal health official is the screwworm playbook. This is the on paper, what do we do when it gets here plan. This is where everything is described vis-a-vis movement restrictions, treatment requirements. Do I need additional documentation to move cattle out of an infested zone? All that good stuff. This is really the meat of what living with this disease is going to look like for us over the next 1 to 5 years potentially that we're dealing with it in the southern part of the country. That draft came out today. It is open for comment. As Gary mentioned, I spent a good chunk of the afternoon reading it and trying to figure out what every single part of it meant. I will say there are parts of it that are extremely confusing, contradictory, and not something that I want to see put in the final draft. Not the least of which because they actually put 2 documents out and they don't match up in every place. So that's step number 1, that's a problem. But in that document, there are a lot of items that are going to slow down the continuity of business if we have a screwworm outbreak. Obviously, dealing with the disease is step number 1, right? But step number 2 is making sure that people can actually move cattle and keep their business going during an outbreak, because we don't want to die by the cure, right? We don't want to be sitting around suffering and interrupting commerce while we're trying to deal with the disease. One of the things we're looking at under that is withdrawal times. There are a lot of requirements right now being considered in the draft, they're not final yet, that have you dosing with injectable ivermectin multiple times right up until shipping, and pretty much makes it impossible with the withdrawal period to send any cattle direct to slaughter, for example. It complicates things at the feedlot stage. There are some requirements in there on getting additional movement permits on top of an ICVI when you're trying to move cattle interstate. There's a lot of requirements in there that frankly are really unworkable, because we don't have enough rural vets in the entire country to do what they want to do under this draft, much less in the border states, alone, or in our southern states where it's going to be warm. So I don't want to get into too many hard and fast, this is what's in the playbook, even though I know it's very newsy right now and it's something you're going to hear about, because a lot of it is still in flux. And I guess that would be my message on the playbook, is there are a lot of items in there that we still need to fine tune and we still need to refine. And there are a lot of items in there that, frankly, we're going to be going to your state vet, we're going to be going to every state vet across the country and saying, are you comfortable enforcing this? Is this something you're going to be able to do? And is this something that's going to damage the industry in your state? Because if it's not, we got to figure out something else. And we do have precedent with that with some other diseases. We've got precedent where we've had some cases where states band together on a regional basis and they sign some kind of state-to-state agreement and say, this is what we're doing to manage this. We're not going by the federal plan. There is precedent for that, and I think that's something that might emerge in this screwworm landscape. But our goal as NCBA is to have a finalized playbook out before the end of November, because we are just getting really far into this thing and people need to have some predictability and need to know what movement restrictions are going to look like. So that is our goal, is to sort of smooth out and make the edits we need to make to that draft and get it done before the end of November. But stay tuned for some news on that, and definitely start talking to your local vet now. Start getting in touch with folks and figuring out what they're thinking about and what they're talking about. Again, I don't mean to be the Chicken Little, but every place I've traveled this year, every state meeting I've been in, every county meeting I've been in, I've said, this is not something to just take it easy on and assume that it's not going to reach you, because things move fast. And again, screwworm, once you have it, is very difficult to get rid of. And I think you could have seen, especially in this part of the world, you've seen how fast something can move when we don't have good controls on it. Look at the Asian longhorn tick, right? That was only in 2 states. Now it's in 23. So these things move fast when we don't have controls on it. And we really want to make sure that people are being proactive, talking to their vet, staying up to date with their state animal health officials. Stay tuned to your State Department of Ag website and see what they're putting out. Just be extra vigilant, because this thing is going to be pretty destructive if it gets away from us in the warmer months of 2026 or in the remaining warm weeks that we have in 2025. There's a lot of other stuff going on specific issues. I'm just looking at the time and I don't want to bore you all to death, but Make America Healthy Again, that's a pretty big one for us this year. The MAHA movement, again, a place where the checkoff has done tremendous work advocating for beef. But the one big deliverable we've got from there were 3 things at the beginning of this year. In addition to cattle disease, traceability, a whole bunch of other stuff, one of the biggest things I work on for NCBA is nutrition. And there were 3 goals we had for the beginning of this year. Get a good and favorable portrayal or response for beef in the MAHA Commission's first report, get a good response in their second report, and get a good favorable outcome for beef in the dietary guidelines. We've knocked out 2 of the 3. We got really, really good results for beef in the MAHA Commission reports. And the biggest way we got that was by not being in it. There were so many things being kicked around in the draft stage of those reports. This, again, Make America Healthy Commission that's being led by Secretary Kennedy at HHS that dealt with production practices, saying no more antibiotics in beef, no more hormones in beef, no beta agonists in beef. Beef is only nutritious and wholesome if it's grass finished. Just a whole bunch of claims that were problematic for our producers that we got scratched out. So the biggest things that I'm proud of in those reports are actually what's not in it, not what was finally included. In the dietary guidelines, we had a pretty clear goal. At the end of the Biden administration, on the way out the door, they put in the recommendation in sort of the previous step of this process, which is the scientific report, saying reduce your intake of meat, poultry, and eggs, replace it with beans, peas, and lentils. We've successfully gotten that struck from the final document that's going to be out at the end of this year, probably a little bit sooner, maybe in November. And we have advocated for some really positive language in there that sort of resets the record on saturated fat, something that's been really highly debated over the last couple of years, resets the record on not all red meat is processed meat. You know, this administration is going after really strongly processed foods, and we are not a processed food, and really just puts us back at the centerpiece of this is a nutritionally dense, in many cases, lean protein that is a powerhouse when it comes to solving all the problems that the MAHA movement says they want to solve. So this is just kind of the end result of the larger conversation we've been having with President Trump, with Secretary Kennedy, with members of the Domestic Policy Council all year to really push and solidify this narrative in their minds, which they were already open to, but you always got to, check twice and be double sure that we are a solution to America's nutrition and health problems. We are not a part of the problem. That is really important for us to push, even when it is an ally like President Trump, even when it is a Republican majority or a Republican president, because the MAHA movement is the broadest, biggest tent, craziest umbrella in some ways that you will ever see in politics. It is amazing how many different constituencies, different types of voters, different consumers who've never cared about politics before, but they're plugging in now, have all come together under this one big umbrella. There are a ton of good ideas in there, and there are a ton of very real issues and crises that need to be addressed, particularly when it comes to children's health. There are also a lot of really unsubstantiated, unscientific, and anti-livestock ideas under that umbrella. And so sort of, again, playing that whack-a-mole and making sure that our opponents don't have an opportunity to slide something in past the goalie without us knowing under that guise of MAHA has been a really big priority for us there. But we're really optimistic about the result we're going to get out of the dietary guidelines. We're feeling really good about the language in there about putting beef back at the center of the plate. And so that's something we're really excited to see. Black Vulture Relief Act reintroduced in the House in April. We're still trying to get a Senate companion reintroduced. We are hampered at the moment by the fact that the government is shut down, but getting a Senate companion introduced to that and getting that rolling again is one of our goals for January 2026. Last Congress, we got some good momentum behind this thing, and this is our bill that would lift the cap on how many vultures you can take. I'm not going to get anybody saying anything that maybe they shouldn't, and I'm not going to say anything, but I think we all know that there are some solutions that everybody is already taking to the vulture problem out there. Our goal with this bill is to make sure that all of our producers are in compliance with the law and don't have to worry about that when you're out doing what you need to do and defending your calves and defending your cattle. So that's the purpose behind the bill, lifting that cap so that we can get some of that red tape out of y'all's way as you're already implementing the solutions that you might be implementing. We had good momentum behind that bill in the last Congress, and then we just ran out of time. We got it passed through the House. We weren't able to get it through the Senate. The clock ran out on us. Congress doesn't work that often. They don't work every week of the year. They manage their schedule very, very jealously. And in terms of sort of moving things through the Senate floor time is one of the rarest commodities on earth right now. And so we just ran out of time. But we're not going to let the same thing happen in 2026. We're going to try and get that passed through the Senate and have that signed into law. Last thing I want to mention, and then I really will stop, is fake meat. We've got a really, really interesting, I'm very excited about it. We've got a very interesting opportunity with this administration and with the MAHA movement. This is a great sort of upside to the MAHA movement right now for us. They are taking an extremely critical look at ultra-processed foods and at some of the approval processes for those products over at the FDA. We do most of our work right under USDA, Department of Ag, and all of the agencies they report to. HHS, or the Department of Health and Human Services, is kind of this behemoth with people who typically never want to listen to us, but they've got the Food and Drug Administration under their umbrella over there, so we still have to deal with them. They are so closed down right now and so hostile to outsiders, particularly coming from the agriculture space, that they were refusing to take meetings for the first couple months of the year, for the first couple months of President Trump's term. And I was quite literally stalking one of their staffers to a tanning salon in DC and waiting outside for her to try to talk to her about issues. So that gives you an idea of how weird it is at HHS right now. But we've got our foot in the door. We've built some good relationships there over the summer. I am feeling like we're in a much better place there, and they are very receptive right now to our input on what to do about lab-grown meat products. These things are not finding a foothold in the market, in the private sector. Nobody wants to buy them. Nobody really wants to eat them. But as long as they have a certain amount of investor cash, they're going to keep cropping up. Every time one company goes belly up, you see another one start to try and get rolling. And they're branching out. They've moved beyond just chicken products. They've got an approval now at FDA to make lab-grown pork fat cells. So where is that going to end up, right? Sausage, blends, grinds, and that's where they have their sights set in the beef world as well. They know that they can't replicate a steak in a petri dish, but they can do some pretty basic cells, and they can do some fat, and they can put something out there that looks reasonably like a pound of ground beef, and they can say, well, it's derived from an animal, it's beef. That is our number one problem with those products. It always has been. We have a number of bills in Congress that we're pushing. Number one is the Fair Labels Act to try and tighten up the requirements on what they're allowed to say on the package for those types of products, make sure that they're not allowed to call it beef if it was not taken from a cow. But there is another way around this. Again, always have a backup plan, always have another way to skin that cat. And this particular administration with the MAHA folks who are now leading HHS, I think we have a really good chance at maybe getting some regulation to tighten up on that industry as well. We always like to go for the belt and suspenders if we can, have a legislative solution, but have a regulatory solution as a backup. You always want to have both because that's the safest way to go. And then when all else fails, we take them to court and we sue them to oblivion. But we like to not have to do that because it's very expensive. And it costs a lot of your dues dollars, frankly, for if you're an NCBA member. So we try to avoid that, but that's what we're pursuing with fake meat. We've got a couple bills in the hopper. We're going to push for those as we always do. We've done that for the last 2 Congresses, but we're really putting a lot of time and effort right now into that regulatory solution and getting Secretary Kennedy and the FDA to sort of tighten up the regulations on what the epitome, the ultimate in ultra-processed foods, those lab-grown meat products are allowed to market themselves as and what they're allowed to slap on the package. That's all I've got for you. I'm going to stop there and open up for questions. I talked a lot. I hope I didn't bore you to death, but there's just a lot going on in DC right now, and this is the final plug I will make. Stay involved with Tennessee Cattlemen. Stay in touch. Read your emails. Read the newsletters. Sign up for NCBA's newsletter. Become an NCBA member. There's a lot of this stuff moving, even during a shutdown. There's an entire branch of government that's not working right now, and we still have all of these things moving and active and impacting your ability to do business and your bottom line. So there is really no week of the year where we get to just ignore this. And if you're not at the table, you eventually end up on the menu. So really encourage y'all to stay involved, but I'll shut up there and take any questions if you have them.